Welcome to Morningstar Christian Chapel YouTube channel. Please remember to hit that subscribe button, like button, and the notification bell so you can find out when we go live or post a new video. And be sure to leave a comment about what God has shown you in this message. Thanks, and enjoy the study.
All right, good evening. Let's open our Bibles tonight to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Having communion tonight as well, so we want to dig in. We've mentioned to you a lot now that Paul wrote this letter from Ephesus where he was planting a church. He would be there for 3 years. He wrote back to the Corinthian church where he had spent a year and a half, probably 7 or 8 years earlier, in planting a fellowship in one of the most corrupt cities, really on the planet at the time. There were some folks who had come to visit Paul. They were elders of the church, others who wrote Paul letters. Paul wrote these 2 letters back. We have at least one letter that he received we don't have, that he mentions in chapter 5, verse 9. But needless to say, this was a church that he loved, and as a father to a church, though he had been gone for some time, he writes to them as a father. He speaks very plainly, but with great love. And he tackles all of the problems that had run into the church. In chapter 8, Paul began a new subject that covers chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11, really rolls into chapter 11, on the liberty that we have as Christians to walk in Christ and how to use it in our lives. It was made all the more consequential by the fact that this church, unfortunately, wasn't doing very well. They were carnal, they were worldly, they were side-taking, they were infighting specialists. They really did need to come back to the Lord if God was going to use them. And denying your liberty for the sake of others was a huge deal because they were used to just taking care of themselves, and that was it. So things had changed, if you will, and needed to change. Paul wrote to them in chapter 8 about eating meat offered to idols. It was the big deal of the day. Some in the church said, well, it's more spiritual if we don't eat it. You know where that came from. Other folks who'd gotten saved when it came from an idol temple, but man, the meat was cheap. And, God doesn't care about it. We're going to eat it. And there was a big upheaval and all, and division that took place as a result of it. Some saints could handle it, some couldn't. And Paul interjects by saying, even though all of those things might be true, we've got to be careful in the way that we use our liberty. And in verse 9 of chapter 8, as well as verse 13, kind of the summary verses, don't use your liberty as a stumbling block to those who are weak. And Paul went and said in verse 13, I'll never eat meat again if it stumbles my brother. So your liberty in Christ cannot become a liability. We talked a lot about the kind of liberties that we have as believers, what we might do with them and how we might hurt each other in the process. In chapter 9, last week in the first 18 verses, Paul continues in that vein, uses himself as an example, and speaks about the fact that as an apostle and also as a founding pastor, if you will, of this fellowship, that he could normally expect the financial support of the church in his full-time labors. But he said, I haven't asked for it. I can get along without it. I would certainly never demand it. And then verse 12, he said, I don't want to hinder the gospel. Whatever my rights might be, and argumentatively so, it certainly isn't worth undermining why I'm here, which is to preach the good news of Christ. He ended in verse 15, 16, 17, 18 by saying, I want to boast about God's care for me, and so I don't push too hard my rights because God has gloriously provided for me. In fact, as far as my calling to preach, I have no choice. I either do it willingly and God blesses it, or I do it unwillingly and he uses me. But in terms of how I use the gifts that God has called me to, and certainly being able to deny myself in this regard, that I have a choice to do. And so we ended in verse 18 last week. We're going to finish chapter 9 this evening. And I guess you could entire this last portion, how much do you want it? Or what is your ultimate goal as a Christian? Still under the topic of liberty. In fact, all of chapter 10 still deals with the same thing. Chapter 11, 12, 13, and 14 just kind of bring it to the church service and say, all right, now we have these gifts. How are you going to use them? Again, it's this idea of serving others. So verse 19, we'll pick up there. Paul goes on and he says this, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win some the more." Paul gives us another reason and purpose for limiting his liberty, and that was his desire and his willingness to meet people where they lived. In other words, there's a lot of non-essential kind of persuasions in this life that sometimes we have to cross those borders to meet with people. Here's Paul's paradoxical statement here in verse 19. "I am free from all men, but I make myself a servant to all men, so that I might reach some men." I'm free to do what I want before the Lord. I'm free not to have to meet the expectations of others, but at the same time, whatever I can do to reach them with the gospel, I'm willing to do. Verse 19, "I make myself a servant." The word servant is the Greek word doulos. It is translated bondservant in a lot of places. A doulos was an Old Testament slave who, when he was allowed to go free, decided to stay. He would stay by choice. He loved his boss, the master. He wanted to serve him, and so he made a commitment that he would spend the rest of his life in his service. It was a choice. No longer, forced by debt or law. It was a choice. He would be given a gold earring to wear in his ear. He was a slave by his own choosing. Paul said that he would limit his freedom in eating meat offered to idols. Verse 13, I think, of chapter 8. But if it meant reaching others for the kingdom of God, he just said, "I'll do that until I die. I'll set it all aside. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he who wins souls is wise." And so Paul was willing to limit his rightful support. He was willing to work a little bit harder so that the gospel would not be hindered. He said he would do it with pleasure. And he adds this, "I will meet folks where they live to bring them to Jesus." From a personal standpoint of study, one of my practices is to try to summarize or encapsulate, there you go, verses together to help me remember what is taught. Here's what I wrote in my Bible, many years ago, but it kind of encapsulates this whole idea. Here's what I wrote. Paul will limit his freedoms and change his habits and temper his likes and set aside his preferences and live without too many hang-ups and have-tos so as not to stumble or isolate himself from the many lost whom he hopes to share with and reach, but he knows he will have to cross over to reach them. And that's really what Paul is saying here. I will just lay aside the convictions I might have if I don't have to cross a line that crosses a conviction so that I might reach others. According to verse 1, back in chapter 9, verse 1, Paul didn't have to take those steps, but he wanted to for the sake of the greatest audience. I just want to reach as many people as I can. In reality, what he did was not a part of the gospel. The gospel is a message, right, of a person. On the other hand, it aided him for his ministry. He wanted to reach everyone. So he sets his rights aside for the love and for the outreach and for the glory of God. I'll do whatever it takes so that people could be reached. In fact, verse 19, that I might win the more. Paul must have been a cool guy to hang around with. I'm not sure he'd be the funnest guy at a party. He seems kind of serious, but we only have his letters. Maybe he was very funny, off the stage here of writing. But it interests me that Paul, in his ministry, saw no social class, wasn't restricted by a religious class, wasn't moved by status. It seems like he was willing to witness to paupers and to princes. He preferred neither. He loved all. The idea was just to reach whoever he could. The homeless were not beneath him. The wealthy were not out of reach to him. The religious or the legalist or the lawless were ripe targets for Paul to share Jesus with. I can draw near them all and bring Jesus with me as I come. It's all part of that liberty. Now, Look, you probably know some folks that are very narrow-minded and very tightly wrapped. I know a few of you. And the idea of you going and talking to a gang member would be frightening and off base. Or spending some time with a drug addict or a prostitute or a homeless man in the streets. That would be out of the question. For Paul, absolutely not. Whatever it takes, I'm willing to go. And he describes some of those things in the verses that follow. Verse 20, to the Jews, I have become as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Look, as a believer, Paul had no need to any longer practice the ceremonies and the rituals and the traditions, but he was willing, if that would mean it would open a door to sit quietly by and accommodate those who still follow these shadows of things that were to come. Paul always went to the synagogue first. Very interesting, because God really delivered him from most of those things. But he went there first and preached his message about Jesus right out of the Old Testament. He loved the Jews. He wrote to the Romans in chapter 9, I think it's verse 3, I would consider that I would be willing to be accursed from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my countrymen, according to the flesh. In other words, I'd be willing to lose my salvation if they could gain theirs. I don't think any of us could say that. I would not dare say that. But wow, what a depth of commitment. He wrote in chapter 10, verse 1 to the Romans, my heart's desire and prayer for Israel is that they might be saved. So Paul went into the whole religious community of the Jews, and he didn't go shaking his head at the things they were practicing. He was embracing the people that he was there to reach. Paul had Timothy circumcised in Acts chapter 16, because most of the places where they were ministering were Jewish communities. Didn't mandate Timothy do that, but Timothy was willing to become all things to all men. He would sponsor, I think if you read Acts 21, 4 men making a Nazirite vow during the Pentecost feast in Jerusalem so that he could prove to the Jewish Christian community that he could live with that, wasn't disdaining those things, just had come to know the Lord and the fulfillment of them. In fact, if you read Acts chapter 18, I think verse 18, it says that earlier in that year, he had been to a place called Centuria where he had shaved his head, and he had made that vow himself so that he might again put himself in a position to reach the folks. I went with my dad to Catholic church for quite a few services after I was saved. I didn't get much out of it. I was sad that people were so entrenched in what was, the interesting thing to me about Catholics is they have the right Jesus buried under a lot of stuff. You don't have to convince him that he's the Son of God, that he was born of a virgin, that he rose from the dead. All those things are essential to the gospel. But then there's a whole lot of stuff, you got to unpack it. But I sat with my dad, would ask me questions, and will you go to church? Yeah, I'll go with you, whatever you want. It doesn't really bother me to be here. It's not exactly what I would, hang on to. Look, Paul didn't teach these things. He didn't give the slightest suggestion that there was a spiritual benefit to keeping the law. He knew better. He testified there in Acts 15 at the council that talked about the grace of God. He preached a life from faith in Jesus and God's grace. Yet if you begin evangelism on the attack, if the first words out of your mouth are contentious, you're probably not in a good place to reach anyone. You isolate yourself. A lot of times you come across as very disrespectful. It usually requires some kind of self-denial on your part to allow the things around you that you're really not driven to at all. You just got to be tolerant. Usually the older you get, the less tolerant you are. But to the religious Jew, Paul said, to those under the law. And it's a very interesting phrase because the term those under the law usually distinguishes the religious Jew from the legalist like the scribe or the Pharisee. Paul was just willing to meet them where they lived. I was invited to do a funeral service, I won't tell you where, in a Catholic church for a gentleman that had gotten saved here, whose entire family was Catholic. And one of his requests when he died was that I would speak at the funeral. Well, no one was happy about that. And they made sure I knew about it. But they wanted to honor his wishes, and so they said you could come. And so I went to the church service that went on with a whole mass and the whole deal and it went on for an hour and a half. And then the priest got up at the end of the service and said, we'll call him Mike for goodness sake. Mike has requested before he died that his pastor, Jack Abeelen, would come up and say a few words. We've been here a long time. I'm sure he'll be brief. So I walked up and this is what I said. I've been here for 90 minutes and haven't heard the gospel yet. And I wonder how you all can face death not knowing what comes next. So because I'm not given much time, let me just tell you that Jesus rose so that you could live. And I'll be outside on the sidewalk if you'd like to talk to me later about it. And then I prayed. So I think you just have to try to be willing to be there. This guy didn't make it easy, but needless to say, you just got to be willing to be around. Things that you're probably not as comfortable with, that you may not believe, that might be difficult for you. But at the same time, Paul wasn't placing value in those things. He was placing value in being willing to be open in his liberty. He says in verse 21, to those who are without the law, I'll become as those without law, not being without law towards God, but under the law towards Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. Paul, it seems to me, could sit down just as easily with Gentiles who had no concept of the Bible, without the law, without a Bible at all, share on their own turf. Go read Paul's time at Mars Hill. Now, he'll tell you he didn't think it was very fruitful. In fact, he will arrive at Corinth pretty disappointed in the fruit. But he was willing. He was willing to talk to them about their unknown God, willing to talk to them about the poets that they had that mentioned how the Lord was so close at hand. He was more than comfortable putting himself in that situation. He did the same thing in Corinth. He shared about the creation and the creator rather than, the law. He talked about man's needs to be forgiven, how everyone needs to be loved, about the assurance of what comes next, about a knowledge of God. Eventually, he just began to preach Christ. You remember Jesus sitting down at the well in Samaria with his ministry to a woman there. And let's face it, if you read the story there in John, she was pretty tough. She might be someone you go, all right, never mind. But Jesus wasn't going anywhere. He became all things to all men, and so did Paul. Paul could eat Gentile foods, no problem. Or he could just sit with the Jews and eat kosher food. No, whatever it takes. Because I want you to know who I know. That was his concern. Sit with those whose customs he didn't follow, whose practices he didn't condone. Pretty good, I would say great missionary advice. If you're going to go to a foreign country, the first thing you better do is just accept the fact that you're in a foreign country. And not sit around going, at home we don't eat like this, we don't do this, that's not how we. Well, then go home. But if you're going to become all things to all men. He says in verse 22, to the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. He approached in weakness people that were weak without intimidation. He didn't lord over the oppressed. He was willing to allow them to be weak. He didn't go, I don't feel like that at all. No, he would become whatever. He would share at their level of comprehension. He would approach them where they lived. He would condescend himself to the place where his ministry was the most effective. I think there's everything right about that. He didn't avoid the poor. He didn't avoid the unlearned, though he was tremendously smart. He didn't avoid the society in which oftentimes he was rejected. He just tailored his approach to meet the needs. In fact, the latter part of verse 22 here, along with verse 23, are kind of defining this section when he says, now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partakers of it with you. All for the sake of the Gospels. And he includes them again because he's writing to them. He says, look, like the Corinthians, I have been made a partaker of God's goodness, and now I have a responsibility to take that good news to others. And that means sometimes, fitting in. Standing your ground with the gospel, certainly, but fitting in. If a person is offended by the gospel, fine. If they are offended by God's word, fine. If they're offended by your biblical devotion or your biblical doctrine, that's fine. But if they turn away from the gospel because you've decided to use your liberty and to lord over their weakness or stand away from them as if you're smarter than someone else, that's not fine. That's not good at all. You have to live your liberty. Jesus told the saints in the Sermon on the Mount that love demanded more than the law. It required self-sacrifice. So he said in chapter 5, I think, verse 39, but I'm not telling you to resist an evil person, but if he slaps you on the right cheek, show him the other one. If he sues you for your tunic, give him your cloak. If he compels you to go 1 mile, go 2. All of those things are to say, die to yourself for the sake of who you're trying to reach. It's all about liberty is surrendered for the sake of ministry. Look, as a Christian, you can have a nose ring. You'll get to heaven with a nose ring. No, I don't know if those go with you or not. You can pierce your eyeball and put your tattoos on, or there's various, I think, culturally unique appearance choices. But I think you should know in exercising them that you are, or you may be limiting your influence. Not sure tattoos is a big limiting factor today. They were in the 60s and 70s, certainly. There were rebels, The Marines got them down at the Pike in New Long Beach, and the bikers got them, and the Hells Angels wore them. I think pretty much now everybody wears them. I think even the police departments allow you to have them now. So those things have a little bit of a change that comes with them. But look, every liberty you have has a attached value to it, if you will, and you can limit your audience. I originally started cutting my hair because it was a big deal for people in the church at the time. Like I think I told you, I had a lady in the front row always complain about my ponytail. And so I brought Kizzard and I said, why don't you cut it off? And she did. Which wasn't so bad, but then 3 weeks later, she left the church. I thought, you didn't do that. She did do that. Today, I have very little choices left in the hair department. I was speaking at John Randall's church this last Saturday to a men's breakfast, and one of the guys that showed up was a guy I went to high school with. I hadn't seen him for years. He's my age. He looked great. I asked him again, are you sure you and I grew up and went to the school together? He looked 20 years younger. I hate that guy. But look, the message is pretty easy to grab hold of. You do whatever you can to reach the lost, even if that means not allowing yourself the things that you have every right to want. So let me ask you personally, what would you be willing to set aside tonight of what you had or want if it would lead one more person to get saved? What would you be willing to do? Paul was so concerned with it that he ends this section using one of his favorite illustrations. He talks about the idea of a runner preparing for a race, his need for self-discipline and self-control, if he had any hopes of winning at all. So here's what he writes, beginning in verse 24. Still same topic. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? So run in a way that you may obtain it. Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore, I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, but not as one who beats the air, But I discipline my body and bring it under subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I might find myself, or I myself should become disqualified. Both the Olympics and the Isthmian Games were held oftentimes in Corinth. Everyone would easily relate to what Paul is writing here, especially of these successful athletes who were running these world record times and really stood out in the culture that honored the flesh more than anything else. The Isthmian Games, which at least in Paul's day overshadowed the Olympics by a great deal, were held in Corinth historically in 51 AD, which might very well have meant that Paul was there. If that's so, all of the competitors, history tells us, stayed in tents. Maybe Paul was working overtime in the games. They had many participants in the race. The word race is the Greek word stadion, which is the word for stadium or racetrack. According to historical records, a stadion was about 600 feet in length, or about an eighth of a Roman mile, if you will. And everyone ran. Paul was right. Everyone, gun goes off or whatever, go. Off they went. But only one runner would get the wreath, the gold medal, the first place. So Paul says this: when it comes to restricting your liberty and being open to approach people in different situations to reach them, run in a way that you win. Or, if you will, accomplish your goal, that you may obtain souls. No one trains that strenuously without a desire to win. I think I've told you the story that, we for years had baseball teams, soccer teams, basketball teams in city leagues here, just because we wanted to get into the community and share the gospel. And we'd cook hot dogs for folks before a game, and the families would come out. We'd ask the other team to come pray with us and all. And so my wife would always go to the games with us, unless there was that 9 o'clock, soccer softball game when it was cold during the winter, and she'd go, "Yeah, you go on your own." And so I'd come home, and sometimes we won a lot, but we get whooped sometimes. And we got whooped one time really bad. And I came home and I said to my wife, she said, "How'd you do?" I go, "We lost." What was the score? 18-5. And then she said this: "Did you have fun?" No, it was 18-5. Fun? It was fun before we started. Nobody, I think, looks forward to losing. Paul's point is, do whatever it takes in your own life to be sure that you win. What does that require? Whatever that requires. That you can reach that heart, that you can win that soul. Spiritually applied, we're really not competing with others, but we're rather seeking to have victory, running the race that the Lord has set before us, overcoming, all of the obstacles in our way. The flesh, the self, the time wasting, demanding our rights, the dues that we owe. Look, there's a sure way to lose, and then there's one way to win. To do whatever it takes to be sure you get to that heart. We are in a race, and we're committed to training to win. Several years ago, actually it was back in 2003, so I guess 20 years ago plus, the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 brackets of the NCAA were held locally here. And we had a friend that got us really good tickets, so my son and I spent the day watching these college kids who were phenomenal players, determined to win. They had practiced for months, they had trained all year, but only one was going to win the championship. And that year, 2003, Syracuse won, which was a team that had never won the championship. So it was a big deal for them. But they had busted their behinds to get to the place where they could win. Paul says that to the church. Instead of all this infighting and majoring on the minors, look, man, we're running a race. We got to win. Do whatever it takes to win. It's pretty practical. He says in verse 25 that everyone who competes for the prize makes a sacrifice, is temperate in everything. They're motivated to win a perishable crown, but we are in it for an imperishable one. Those who run must make sacrifice. The word temperate here is very interesting. It's a very long Greek word, and I tried to pronounce it the other day and just figured if you want to look it up, you go ahead. It's very long. But it literally just means to show self-control. Self-control. If you show up to run the marathon and the best you've done is walk to the bathroom, you're not going to run. You're going to stop somewhere along the line. It's going to take you some time. But if you want to win, it's going to require lots of discipline. You have to watch what you eat. I'm always amazed at the Olympics. I like watching them, but I can't for the life of me see spending that much time just to get a gold medal. I suspect, like the college players today, they're just looking for a payday, which is really the way out. You make millions of dollars just by, being popular, I guess. In any event, if you're really going to compete, though, you got to eat the right things and train and rest. You got to have the best equipment. You got to get the right shoes. You got to have somebody analyze. You need coaches. I mean, it's a big deal, isn't it? Especially in these races that are, lost and won by, I don't know, 100th of a second. I don't know what you can do in 100th of a second. Were you in first? No, I lost by a blink of an eye. You're kidding. You should have trained harder. It was a blink of an eye. We're almost the same. And they did it for a perishable Stephanos, a laurel wreath that just died in your house when you kept it around for an hour. Temporary applause. Peter would later write to the church that the Lord has begotten us to a lively hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And we have an inheritance that's incorruptible and undefiled, that doesn't pass away, that's eternal in the heavens, reserved for you. Look, you reach somebody with the gospel, they're going to live forever. They're going to meet you at heaven's door when you die. Here they are. He led me to Jesus. Now he's here. I mean, is that amazing? So what do you got to do? Well, I got to pray, and I got to study, and I got to fast, I got to serve, I got to deny myself, and I got to put others first. I got to keep my eye on the heavenly calling. I got to run to win. Paul, in his last letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy, I think, chapter 2, he said to Timothy, who's now at 40 years old, the pastor in Ephesus, where Paul is writing this letter. He said, Timothy, make sure that you endure hardships as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No man who is in warfare engages himself in the affairs of this life, but he rather is concerned that he might please him who has enlisted him as a soldier. And if you're competing in athletics, you're not crowned unless you compete by the rules. Give it your all. He finally said to Timothy towards the end of that letter, I'm poured out as a drink offering. My time of departure is hand. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've given it my all. The winner is often the one who wants it the most, who gives it the most, who's willing to pay the most. I think that's why when you hear people repeat as champions in football or baseball, it's more amazing because they've gotten there. The first time is, I got to have it. The second, I have had it. And oftentimes what you do is you find champions ending up, in the middle of the pack, or even worse by the end of the second year, because the motivation is gone. Unfortunately, I think for a lot of Christians today, their dedication to that kind of a life is minimal. They come when they can. They serve when they want. They help when it fits the schedule. Others can do it. I'm pretty busy. It's pretty late. It's pretty early. It is pretty much. But look, Christianity is not a spectator sport. The Lord doesn't say, hey, come sit in the bleachers, watch the other people run. I'm a cheerleader. No. There's no calling for cheerleaders. Go back and read Hebrews chapter 12, the first 3 or 4 verses, where Paul said, After listing in chapter 11 all of these wonderful examples of dying in faith, not having received the promise, and some having victory and some dying for their faith. And then Paul said, we have this great cloud of witnesses that's watching over us. Now you run. This is your generation. This is your time. Now you get the handle. You run now. It's falling into your laps. The participants have to run and run to win. So, are you running? Or are you just watching the church run by? Have you sat here in the same seat for 10 years and done nothing? Or are you busy serving the Lord? At some point, you got to get in the race. You can't sit in the infield. Just attending church and leaving is not enough. That's pointless. It's fruitless. It's disappointing. And one day the race will be over. Doesn't help. And I love the comparison that Paul makes in verse 25, because he says, in the world you will find people that give their whole life for a perishable crown, an olive branch, a laurel wreath, a gold medal. You are bringing people to Christ. I had a really good job before I got in the ministry. I made a lot of money. You know what the frustrating thing for me was? Someone could replace me in 2 seconds. And it was all about corporate profits. And then when I became a pastor, it was all about eternal things. They didn't come as quickly. They aren't as easily tallied or measured. But what more could you ever want to do than the eternal things that no one can undo, that honors the Lord who called you? It's amazing that, our crowns of service and lives can change people's eternity. But you can still sit by and never get into the race, and you'll make it. But that'll be about it. So Paul says in verse 26, my own commitment is that I want to run. But I'm not aimlessly running. I'm not just expending a lot of energy. I have a goal. I'm not just beating, the air around me. I'm training with purpose and with aim. He says 4 times in verses 19 through 22, I would do and be whatever it takes to win the lost. I'll do and be whatever it takes. God, whatever it takes. I'm not a shadow boxer. I'm fighting the good fight. I'm running to win. He's in the ring. He's in the race. And so should we. And he makes no apologies to them for being in it to win and giving it his all. It is so easy to easily or quickly be turned from the task at hand. I've been trying to lose weight. I'm down quite a bit now. But boy, I have a ways to go. And the last 10 days, I haven't lost an ounce. And I've been eating good. And I get on So I even got a new scale. I'm pretty sure that was the problem. No, it's just, it was me. It's easy to get turned away from the goal if you don't keep your eye on the prize. You start going to church and you're excited. And then pretty soon, gosh, it's raining out. I don't know. I'll get wet and stuff. Paul said the goal that he set was serious and he would take it seriously. And notice in verse 27 that one aspect of this battling and running and self-denial had to do with fighting his old flesh, the old nature. The word discipline here, very interesting word, hubopiazo. It means to leave bruises under your eye. It's what Paul literally says, I punch myself in the face. I give myself a black eye. Now that's crazy, he didn't do that. But his point is, I would knock myself out if necessary, fighting the flesh. I just want to bring it into subjection. I want to enslave it to me, not be enslaved to it. There are many who begin their Christian lives with great enthusiasm and devotion. I always think it's the best bunch of people to hang around with are new believers. They're like vacuum cleaners. Everything you say, what verse was that? I'd like to write that down. You look like an expert. The hardest thing to do is hang around 5-year-old Christians who've heard it all before. No enthusiasm, no excitement. Lost the vision. Somewhere before the race is finished, they grow weary in well-doing and break training. And Paul says they can even get to the point where they disqualify themselves. They become useless in the plans of God. It isn't that they don't belong to him. They're just not getting anything done. So even good things can interfere with the best things. So look, don't lose track of the context, you know? It's about setting aside our rights or privileges willingly for the sake of the gospel and the salvation of many, and even things that we have a right to, he's willing to set aside, whatever it takes. Greater things we can do than serve all men. There's no greater thing. Run the race, reach with the gospel. So I know it was a hard sell to the Corinthians because they were so selfish, so obstinate with each other, so selfish in their relationship, so turned away from what they had been called to do. But I find myself more and more drawn to this whole idea of, just become everything you can be to whoever. If you can live with it. Sometimes we have drunk people show up here on church services, and they're pretty plowed, some of them. They kind of walking off the street. Our policy is, you don't make any noise, you're welcome. You start yelling and screaming, probably not going to work out for you. But if you're just willing to, fall asleep, I don't care. Come on in. You need Jesus. You got to hear about him. And the church should be that way. We should be all embracing. Do I rejoice in the homosexual community these days? It's horrifying to me. To me, it's the last stage of any kind of culture in society before it falls apart. But I'm willing to witness to anybody that'll talk to me. The Jehovah's Witnesses standing on the corner with their signs, stop and talk to them. Why not? You have the good news. They don't. You can go fight or you can go love them. If they're willing to listen, I'm willing to tell them. So come on, church. Amen? Let's have communion. Father, thank you for your word to us tonight. I know that your greatest desire for us is to be those vessels through whom you can set your word into and through and out from, so that the world would know your Son. And Lord, that we might be tolerant and willing to take that place of just becoming all things to all men, so that we might win all the more. Willing to do whatever it takes. To take time with those that the world doesn't want to take time with. To take time with those that the world sets aside. Or those who are harsh critics of our faith. If they're willing to talk, I'm willing to talk. Because Jesus is life. And he'll bring life to those who call upon his name. If tonight you find yourself maybe disassociated from the culture, the church, wherever, your family, know this: Jesus has an open door policy. And he invites you to come to him and to put your faith in his sacrifice and give him your life and your trust that what he did on the cross, which we celebrate tonight, he did for you. He did for us, but he also did it for you. And tonight, as we take the bread and the wine or the cup, the grape juice, and we consider what they represent, and we realize that communion brings us back to where we started. Our faith in Jesus, his sacrifice for us, our dependence completely upon him. It'll stop us as we go through this life of trying to get independent, because communion keeps bringing us back to that dependency. And tonight, be reminded again that Jesus is the one you need. And because of him, you have a race to run and a message to preach and people to reach and a self to deny. There's work to be done. Boy, does this world need Jesus more than ever before.